Hi, I'm Akash Suchak, Grants and Special Programs Manager at CAA. Our topic for discussion today in this RAAMP Practicum is museum leadership and the role of research. I'm here with Martina Droth at the Yale Center for British Art. Martina, good morning.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having us here. It's a pleasure, an absolute incredible collection.
It's my pleasure.
I want to start by just asking you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background.
So I'm Martina Droth. I'm Deputy Director of Research and Exhibitions and Publications, also Curator of Sculpture here at the Center. I've been here for 9 years.
Wow, a long tenure. Congratulations.
It's starting to feel long, yeah.
Where were you before that?
I lived in the UK and I worked at the Henry Moore Institute, which is a gallery, exhibition centre and research centre in the north of England.
Very nice. What's your role at the center?
So I oversee research, broadly speaking, which includes public programs, education, academic outreach, a visiting scholar program, and all of our student positions across the museum. I also oversee exhibitions and publications, obviously a constantly changing dynamic program of exhibitions and the books that we publish. And also the reference library comes under my purview.
Wonderful. So it's a lot of activities that you're in charge of, it sounds like.
It's essentially, I would say, the programmatic aspects of what we do, the things that change, and the programming, including the exhibitions, and also, broadly speaking, the research activities and outputs, with exhibitions and publications being our biggest research outputs.
And do you find that in terms of content versus administrative duties, do you find it's equally balanced, or does it tip in one direction or the other?
I think it's hard to separate content and administration, actually, because I think that one, in a way, underpins the other. So in thinking about how to do a program involves thinking about what the intellectual details of it are going to be, while also thinking about the kind of format that would best suit the nature of the discussion or whatever the outcome is supposed to be. So I find it hard to really draw a line between that. There is a lot of administration, but I feel that administration is, in a sense, part of the content driver and part of the creative work of thinking about the directions we need to go in terms of what we're doing.
What's the model of governance at the center? How do decisions get made? What's the staff structure? What's the board structure?
So we're unusual in that we don't have a board. I think that marks us out as from other museums in a way that's quite significant. So we're governed ultimately by the university. The director makes the decisions. But what we do have in terms of external governance is an advisory committee. We meet with the committee twice a year, and they are our colleagues across the university, faculty members from different departments, and some of the people who are in charge of other special collections, such as Beinecke, Lewis Walpole Library, the library system. So really they are our sounding board and our advisors, with the potential to give us feedback and direction as to what we're doing, whether our programs are as effective as they should be, that kind of thing.
And when you involve faculty in the advisory board, are they typically art historians, or is it a range of faculty?
It's a range, and I think that's a really important point to make, actually. We obviously work very closely with the History of Art department, but we also work very closely with faculty across different disciplines, and that's part of our mandate, is really to promote an interdisciplinary program. We work with the School of Music, the Divinity School, the Art School, Architecture, English, History, psychology, as you'll discuss with my colleague Jennifer later, the School of Medicine, School of Nursing. And we develop different kinds of programs to engage those communities.
It seems that the history of mental health and the history of psychiatry is sort of having a renaissance, although it's been of interest for some time now, with Foucault's work among other intellectual historians. How do you see the relationship between the history of art and a collection such as this and the history of ideas or intellectual history?
How do we see that manifest here?
Yeah, or is there an engagement here? For instance, is Jennifer's project about psychiatry also about the history of mental health?
Our aim really is to engage all kinds of audiences. And in education, there is a program, for instance, for people on the spectrum. And to create programs that audiences of all kind can enable them to become involved in the museum. So I would say that the extent of our engagement with those kinds of questions, I think it comes down on the one hand on a personal research basis in terms of how somebody's engaging with those historical questions and theoretical questions. But I would say the more important aspect of it is really how we as a museum interface with and engage with different parts of the public community and the Yale community. So we do work with the psychiatry department, and Jennifer's work there is really about something much broader that ranges beyond what the psychiatry department does, that has to do with the portraits that are hanging on the wall. That's also a question that's alive and active for the colleges and for the School of Medicine and for so many different parts on the campus. So the questions go beyond the discipline or the school to questions where we as a museum can have a stake and have an involvement in the discussion. For example, talking about portraits and the kinds of portraits that get collected and hung on walls.
I think that's a kind of beautiful explanation of the sort of interdisciplinary research that takes place here, so thank you for that. I want to turn the discussion a little bit to research as well, so I know that's a big part of your role as well as the mission of the center. So first I want to ask about your division, the Division of Research and Education, sort of how you direct the division and how the division fulfills the mission of the center.
So the division as a whole encompasses research, education, exhibitions, publications. And I guess I would say that you're asking me about research, and it's not something that lives in the research department as such. The research department is really there to facilitate and to enable and organize research to happen across the institution. So research happens in every department that is active in the collections or in exhibition programs or in public programs. We all do research in order to determine what the nature of those programs or exhibitions or projects is going to be. So just want to move away from the idea that research is a thing that happens on someone's desk or in a department. The department is really there to facilitate.
So who conducts research here?
So the curators and the education staff, actually people across the institution conduct research. It depends on how you define it. It's not just about art history. Of course, that happens too, because we're an art museum. But for instance, the head of education, Linda Friedlander, conducts research with the Child Study Center to ascertain how visual literacy improves classroom literacy. And that's research. There's audience research that happens in the public relations department, for instance. So I want to think about research more as an open concept and a dynamic one that engages a lot of people in thinking about what we do. And I think maybe most importantly is something that's outward facing. So of course curators are working on exhibitions and collections and doing research on objects. But it's not only about their own personal interests and their specialisms. It's really about opening up to the whole world of research, scholarship, and potential knowledge that is out there. And that's why I think we have a research department, is to ensure that there's an open door, that people come in and engage with our collections and also teach us new ways of thinking about objects, so that we're open to that larger world of rethinking our collections, which I think can't just happen internally in the museum. It has to be an open dialogue and a process where other people can come in and shape our own thinking.
Is there a range of methodologies employed when research is conducted here? I imagine there would be.
Yes, I think absolutely. And it kind of depends project to project. Let's say we're talking about developing an exhibition. One thing that we've come into the practice of doing is to organize meetings and workshops where we bring people who are either working in a similar field or in the field around the table to talk about what are the issues at stake here. And in a way, the purpose of that is to make sure we're not just working at our desks and doing our own little projects and depending on our own specialisms, but to open ourselves up to thinking about issues that are happening in the larger world of that field, to make sure we're taking on board the issues. An example I could give you is we're opening an exhibition on William Hunter, the anatomist, in February. And we have had really interesting and eye-opening discussions, not just with art historians, but with historians of medicine and midwives and people in the School of Medicine who have opinions about how William Hunter conducted his anatomical practice, how he acted as a male midwife. And those are issues that we can't just study through art history and through our own knowledge that we might bring to someone like Hunter. It's got to be opened up to the larger questions that an individual such as that brings. And we can't have all the answers. And I think our job is to open out the questions and get some different kinds of answers and perspectives.
What questions, theoretical, stylistic, or historical, motivate your research?
Motivate my research? Well, so I work on sculpture, broadly speaking. And I guess the thing that I'm particularly driven by and interested in is the fact that sculpture is such a broad set of practices and object types. It's almost impossible to define. Yeah. And it's an area that I feel shows how art history needs to engage with other fields and contexts. You know, maybe sculpture, more so than certain kinds of painting, has to be looked at in the context of its society, its culture, its period. If we're thinking, for example, of sculpture in the public realm, the monument, the memorial, you can't apply the kinds of methodologies we use for an easel painting to thinking about that sculpture. It's not just about an individual artist's intentions. It's not necessarily about expression or individuality at all. In fact, it might be the very opposite. It's about fulfilling a public demand or a political moment. So I think that sculpture is a field that prompts its scholars to think outside of art history and to take on board a much wider range of issues than maybe we're used to thinking about when we think about art history.
So I want to turn our attention now to the collection, and I want to ask you, Martina, how many objects do you have in the collection?
So we divide the collection into different parts, and we have about 3,000 paintings and sculptures, about 40,000 prints and drawings, almost the same again in rare books and manuscripts, and almost the same again in the reference library.
How did the works of artists from different regional identities and nationalities fit into the British art collection?
So that's a really interesting question, which obviously is about the word British in our title. And it's something that we constantly have to deal with, and it's not actually easy to answer. I would say the word nationality in particular is a really tricky word, and one that's so difficult at this moment in time that we're living in for everybody to deal with. Nationality isn't something stable or given. It's something that's mutable and changeable. There's also the question of place of residence. There's so many different ways to think about this question of identity and nationality. And I would say that our reinstallation, when we rehung the collection a few years ago, we called it Britain in the World, and we wanted to open up this very question about how we define British. And I think to get away from thinking about it in too narrow a way. But I would say that, you know, every project that we do challenges that whole notion of Britishness and forces us to think about how do we define that. What I think we shouldn't do as an institution is to define the word British for other people, but to raise the question of what that word can mean. And it's also one of the ways in which I feel a British Art Center in North America can be a relevant place, because all of us are dealing with these questions of belonging and conferred nationalities or desired nationalities. And I think that these are some of the questions that, you know, at the forefront in our political landscape at the moment, in Britain as well as here. We've just had a vote to leave the European Union. What does that mean for Europeans living in Britain? How do they now define their nationality and their sense of belonging? So I feel that this question comes into our collections, into what we can buy, into how we describe the work, into what kinds of exhibitions we organize all the time. And I think it has to be kept a kind of a living, open question, and one that probably never has a stable answer.
As you know, CAA has roughly 10,000 members who are working in the field of the visual arts in a professional capacity. Some of them aspire toward a leadership position or a research position within an academic art museum. What advice would you offer those people?
So depending on where they are in their career paths, for younger people setting out, I would advise them to gain as much breadth of experience across the museum as possible. I think it's really important to understand the different parts of a museum and how a museum works. And maybe most importantly, regardless of where you want to end up within the museum, to think about audiences. That's the most important thing, how we connect with people in all of our work, whether we're in a curatorial department or an education department or a PR department. Really, it's all about how we're connecting with people outside and how our work becomes both visible and remains relevant to our audiences. It's been great over the last few years. We've really been determined to use the affiliated society slot that CAA generously grants us automatically. And we've done some really interesting sessions. Last year, for instance, we did a session on material culture. What is its relationship with art history? And coming up in February, we're doing a session about artists in relation to research institutes, which obviously is a very relevant question both for CAA members and also for us as ARIA institutes, because not all of our institutions offer artists fellowships. And so we're grappling with the idea of what it means to include artists amongst our residency programs.
The last question I have for you is about RAAMP, the Resources for Academic Art Museum Professionals, which is a grant-funded program at CAA. I wanted to ask you, what resources would be useful to you as a curator and as a deputy director that you might find in this online resource repository known as RAAMP?
Well, I've already watched some of the films that are available on the website, and I think it's very useful to be able to hear other museum professionals and leaders of educational programs or research programs talking about what they're doing and why they're doing it and the ways in which they engage with audiences. So I think that's a very useful resource on the RAAMP website. And I think it's also really important for us to have the kinds of guidelines and advocacy news that you present and for us to feel part of a community.
Thank you so much, Martina, for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to seeing you at the annual conference.
Likewise. Thank you, Akash.